This is Let Me Sum Up, your regular deep dive into recent reports on climate and energy. I'm Luke Menzel, recording today from the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I'm delighted to be joined by my two co-hosts, the inimitable Frankie Muscovich. Hello, Frankie.
Hello, Luke, and I'm joining you from Gadigal land in Sydney.
And noted Twitter chef Tennant Reid. G'day, Tennant.
Hello, I'm feeling very imitable today.
On this week's show, we're going to look at the latest on decarbonisation pathways for the industrial sector from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And it's lucky we've done our homework this week because there's not that much going on in energy policy to talk about. Tennant, would you agree?
Bit of a snooze, really. I think everyone can be comfortable and relaxed, especially this winter, because there's nothing to see here in energy land. Definitely not.
Frankie, unprecedented spikes in gas and electricity prices are being described as an energy apocalypse, and while it demands a response, there's actually not that much a federal government can do super quickly, is there?
No, unfortunately there isn't. There are very few interventions in the immediate term that could really be brought to bear. The only prospect for relief, I think, for vulnerable low-income households and perhaps those businesses that are also facing, I think, existential threat is some form of government handout or support to see them through the worst of what's coming this winter. We've got plenty of good ideas between us, I think, for the medium and longer term, and funnily enough, a big focus on things like energy efficiency and reducing the amount of energy we consume to start with is probably one of the best ways of dealing with this.
I think that's almost the trick, isn't it? Being able to keep in our heads at the same time, like the immediate response, which is necessarily going to be that direct support, whether it's to vulnerable households or to businesses that are particularly vulnerable. I'm thinking about like gas-intensive manufacturers and food processors, but simultaneously keeping an eye to some of those long-term opportunities to reduce our vulnerability to these sorts of shocks, and obviously energy efficiency and electrification and some of that sensible stuff on the supply side as well to bring on some of the new capacity we need to replace those old coal-fired generators. All those things need to be accelerated, if anything, right, Tennant?
Yeah, so it's a time when it's really important to keep in mind where we ultimately want to go when we're evaluating how we want to get through the next 6 to 18 months. Because there's going to be any number of ideas coming forward. A lot of them are not necessarily going to be good ideas. And even the good ideas may take an awful lot of doing. So, dare I say, there's never been a more relevant time for a new podcast about gathering up some of the information that you might have not had time to get across to have a more well-rounded, better informed, broader approach to energy and climate.
I like how you turned Australia's energy apocalypse into a pitch for our new podcast.
Let's just get our priorities in order, hey? And Luke, do you think that this could be the shining moment for energy efficiency in Australia's policy landscape? Is it time for Cinderella to come to the ball?
I reckon yes, but I also think that I'm very cautious about overstating how much it can achieve quickly.
Yes.
So I think that there's never been a better time to start putting in place those frameworks that will allow energy efficiency to reduce our vulnerability to these sorts of shocks, to put downward pressure on bills for households and for businesses, and also thinking about the things that work together in terms of that behind-the-meter transition. Energy efficiency and electrification are going to be absolutely crucial in a lot of parts of the economy, but acknowledging that that's not necessarily going to do anything very much at all in the next 2, 3, 6 months when people are really feeling the pain.
The sad news is, don't worry, there's time. There's plenty of crisis left for energy efficiency Cinderella to get the dress made, secure the coach, and make her way to what is a very unhappy celebration at the palace. The doleful opening of electricity and gas bills will be going on for years to come. maybe Cinderella can be fashionably late to this one, but there will be plenty for Cinderella to do.
And that coach is not turning back to a pumpkin at midnight, right?
I don't even know what that would look like. Metaphor integrity breach.
This started as a Disney princess fantasy and turned into a Guillermo del Toro horror. Which might be appropriate. The Pan's Labyrinth of Australian energy crises. Shall we talk about a report?
Look, I think let's start writing a script. We've got a blockbuster on the way here. But all right, fine. IPCC, they're pretty good too, I guess.
They're pretty good too.
Yeah.
Since 1998, the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has brought together the world's leading climate experts to survey the current state of the climate science and, importantly, what we can do about it. They are up to their 6th assessment report, and having covered the physical science in Part 1 and climate impacts in Part 2, in April this year they released Part 3, which looked at options for mitigation, the pointy end of the problem, where we roll up our sleeves and actually drive down emissions. Part 3 covers every sector of the economy and is over 1,000 pages long, and I might say to Tennant's great disappointment, we have elected not to attempt to discuss the whole thing, but we have all taken a look at... No, Tennant, come on. You got to get over it, mate. We have elected to look at one really crucial chapter, which I know is near and dear to your heart, Tennant, focusing on mitigation pathways for the industrial sector. And might I say, I was actually really pleased, given we really did absolutely need to choose just one chapter. This was a good one because industrial decarbonisation is so crucial to decarbonisation pathways in every other sector of the economy. So, Tennant, what stood out for you in this chapter?
So there's a lot in it, but I want to start by not looking at the individual sectoral mitigation technologies, although there's a lot of interesting stuff in there about what do you do in steel, what do you do in cement, but the broader perspective that this chapter gives on how we think about mitigation strategies for industry is it's really good. We spend a lot of time arguing in Australia about either repowering the electricity sector, or we have a little discussion of energy efficiency. We have some fierce arguments about CCS. But what this chapter includes is a sense of what a completely integrated set of industry strategies looks like, where you're not just looking at repowering and reprocessing the what happens inside the facility, but you're also looking at the circular economy. You're looking at the underlying levels of demand for the products that industry is making. You're looking at efficiency in design of the ways those products are used, so that every part of the equation is helping to reduce emissions. In part because if you're just replacing all the factories with factories with different processes, it's going to take a long time and a lot of capital to achieve full transformation there. It's easier to achieve the emissions reductions if you're also pushing down on the amount of product needed to meet the need that society has, and if you're also maximising the rates of recycling of materials throughout the economy. So I think it's a really good encouragement to just think a bit broader than the quite narrow alleys that Australian policy argument typically runs down.
It certainly was for me, as someone that mainly focuses on energy, to work through a chapter which has a lot of implications for how we think about energy and energy productivity in the industrial sector. Energy intensity, obviously super important, but materials efficiency, as you're intimating, Tennant, absolutely crucial as well. And thinking about sort of the interactions between the different sectors of the economy, the kind of demands that, the construction sector or, consumer goods and our expectations around that, if we can sort of manage those, where we're sort of lowering the scale of the challenge, I suppose, that the industrial sector is facing in its decarbonisation journey.
I read this chapter and I found myself thinking you could look at it both optimistically and pessimistically, in that, as you say, Tennant, the sort of macro view of this is that the conversation and indeed a lot of the efforts in terms of policy making and industry transition has been really focused on the production side of things rather than creating markets to enable demand for low carbon products or recycled content and things like that. So those pathways are underrepresented in the mitigation potential over the short term, like particularly the next decade. But then you could see that sort of grow out. And I think that's a really exciting space, and there's early leadership. But the fact that it hasn't been such a focus to date is probably a reflection of some of the commentary in there that says, you know, a lot of the different sectors we're talking about here are sort of global fragmented supply chains where there haven't been joined up efforts. And when you don't have that, plus sort of progressive policy making by individual governments, you're not going to see that systems sort of level transformation happening, right?
Yeah, I think that's right. And some of the issues that are raised are they are really hard to address, or at least you'd have a lot of grumpy people. So one of the factors in the equation that I raised earlier is the underlying service demand. So say we're talking about how do we reduce emissions from cement. Well, one of the issues there is how much housing do we need? And another is how big does a house need to be? And you can imagine an incredibly unpopular approach to this to say either, mitigation is about fewer people. I don't think that's a very popular or practical or positive take. Or let's force people to live in tiny houses. But there's a more plausible way, which is, are we forcing people to live in houses that or other structures that are actually more than they want, more than they would be willing to pay for if they had the option? And so thinking about minimum lot sizes that are set in some urban planning systems, regulations that are maybe inflating the requirements for some end users. That's, may not have all the answers, but that could be a useful supplement to work on, in addition to alterations and revolutions in the underlying production techniques.
I think that's to me, that's an example of the more extreme end of the spectrum of behaviour change that we're trying to drive. I look at this and go, wouldn't it be nice if we were starting to put in place systems that maximise the value of materials that are already, in use and supply? So, I'll pick the property and construction sector. It's very close to home for me, but it's also one of the biggest sectors that demand stuff from the industrial sector. So building construction and products is a huge source of emissions for this sector. Building owners are stewards of materials for decades, right? So if we were serious about doing this, rather than perhaps starting the conversation that we all need to live in smaller houses, and potentially we'll definitely get to that. Perhaps we should think about how can we keep the structures that we have, or maintain and reuse and repurpose the materials that we already had, rather than, I guess, sticking with the default situation, which is digging new things out of the ground, right? We want to maximise the value of materials that are already in the supply chain. And to me, it points to, I think, the current failure, but also potential for public policy drivers that would support that. So the reason we're not seeing, more recycled content in concrete, particularly in residential homes, is because it's not de-risked enough for the private sector to use that en masse. So you don't have governments publishing standards for how that's used that would then give confidence to product manufacturers to put out sort of standard forms of products that would do that, and you'd be able to go buy a bag of, cement mix from Bunnings that had a majority of recycled content. Like, we're not there yet, but there are some really obvious policy levers that could be pulled to, to start to drive that change.
It's one of the reasons why the sort of conversation that's building so much momentum just over the last couple of years around embodied carbon is so exciting.
Yeah.
Someone that's very interested in, what's happening in buildings and in terms of their end use, but also very interested in, what's happening in manufacturers around the country. It's starting to build that connective tissue between these two sectors. And in an Australian context, the property sector is probably the most progressive and informed and engaged around this great challenge of mitigation. And so for them to be demanding these products and demanding this transparency, it acts as a prompt for the industrial sector, but also means that effort starts to be valued. So the manufacturers of building products that actually investigate, that invest, that are able to engage with those, what I'm sure will be voluntary programs disclosing sort of carbon intensity of products in the first instance, will get some benefit for that in terms of their supply chain, which is super exciting.
Yeah, also building up demand for clean materials, like credible long-term demand, is really essential to get investment in supply. The state of things is that for most of what we're talking about, currently very low or zero emissions production processes have if they are available in a commercial sense at all, have a significant cost premium over fossil intensive processes. And so the challenge of getting investment and making it viable to manufacture in that way is really crucial. And there were a bunch of interesting policy ideas listed in the IPCC report. The role of private procurement was certainly noted, and we've seen some very important steps taken there by big buyers around the world in the last couple of years. But public procurement, they note, has a role to play. Certification of greenhouse gas content, which is pretty complex, needs maybe some more transparency and comparability. Performance standards and building codes have got a role. Financial incentives, and there was some quite interesting ideas there, including materials equivalents of some of the forms of incentive we've seen applied in the energy sector. So feed-in tariffs for clean materials or contracts for difference for materials, public or private green premiums for clean aluminium, clean steel, and so forth, extended producer responsibility. And it's just it's a broader set of concepts to be thinking about, although, of course, they do have plenty to say about carbon pricing as well.
So Tim, there's someone, in your day job who is charged with actually kind of, the art of the possible. There were some very exciting ideas in the report around public policy, very ambitious in the current context, not just in Australia, but really around the world to adopt a lot of those very quickly. Like, what did you feel like was the most plausible or the most actionable in terms of those suggestions?
So carbon contracts for difference are actually starting to happen. Germany is pioneering this, and we'll learn quite a bit from whatever their experience is. They've pioneered a bunch of forms of support for clean economy development. Public procurement it is very obvious as a thing to make use of, but I think it's a bit complicated in practice because there's so many things that governments want to or are being urged to advance through the procurement process. It's a crowded space. I think we're going to see plenty of pressure on public budgets to deliver value for money. And so it should be a sensible place for action. I think there's two risks. One is that it's kind of crowded out by other priorities. The other is that it's sort of a content light ticker box. Has your materials supplier got a net zero commitment off in the misty future? And so I think there is a challenge to translate it into both meaningful and actionable obligations. I think, though, that we're potentially going to be seeing a deepening of the safeguard mechanism in Australia. That's a very relevant thing for the sorts of heavy industry that we're talking about. And that, that's something that in my day job, with a couple of asterisks, I'm very supportive of as a concept. A lot of work to be done to make that happen. But the cost increment issue is still relevant. The in a messy world that's acting on climate, but also every country that's acting on climate is nervous about the competitiveness of their trade exposed industries. I think we need to both take seriously the competitive challenge, and there's thoughts on this in the IPCC as well, including on carbon border adjustments, the rebating, controversially rebating carbon costs to exporters, but controversially in a different way, imposing carbon costs on importers of products of concern. And I just say that the cost data in this chapter really highlights that what we're talking about are relevant, significant cost increments for materials suppliers, but pretty small, like they translate to pretty small cost increases for end users.
Yeah, that stood out for me as well. It's just the reality that as for end users, this is entirely manageable. It is sort of how you create the incentive structures for those investments to be made upstream.
Well, to your point on carbon border adjustments, and one of the key takeouts I took from reading this section is that I think there's a real need for better transparency in the way that countries are both sort of accounting for their emissions in terms of the embodied emissions in products that they import and export, and then the flow-on sort of effect of that through private procurement. I was staggered that very few countries actually account for the embodied emissions of their industrial products, and then the few that have saw their associated emissions increase up to I think threefold for the UK. So it's an enormous impact, and I think to an extent, because we've had these global fragmented supply chains, the problem's outsourced, right? It's always somebody else's problem. So if we start to bring transparency, and I'm interested in the concept of labelling, a bit like nutrition labelling, picking up a product and sort of being able to say, oh, okay, this many emissions on this scope. I mean, the nerdiest form of nutrition labelling we could contemplate amongst ourselves.
I think, Frankie, we could all do with reducing our carbon waistline, right?
Absolutely. So I think that needs to be the basis on which we start to build on the other levers that are necessary, right? So I agree. I think public procurement has an extraordinary role to play, especially through the procurement of infrastructure projects, which governments at every level throw enormous amounts of money at.
Sometimes without a lot of business case to go on.
Janet, wash your mouth out.
But the other thing as well to note here, and I think the reason that, as you say, it looks a little light in terms of having commitments there, it masks the complexity even around the level of government sort of involved in certain products. So the Commonwealth Government in Australia has certain levers at its disposal. Presumably it would be the one to preside over some form of labelling requirement or publishing of standards around recycled content that would de-risk that, both for private sector, but also to be used in referencing for public procurement projects. But the infrastructure on the ground is very much more a state government issue. And then when we're talking about waste collection and retrieval and material recovery, then you're involving local councils at that level. So it's not as though the Commonwealth Government on their own can fix this. It's going to require coordination through all levels of government as well.
And I think our discussion today has focused on what the chapter focuses on, which is some of those, harder to abate sectors, some of those, the highly complex interactions between sectors that will take some years to unpick. It also makes the point on the way through, there's plenty we can do straight away in industry.
Yes.
And, things like, low temperature heat. It's very bullish on heat pumps, for example, energy efficiency, just making better use of the energy that industrial players are using in the creation of their products. Also gets a major shout out. And so all of these things, all the simple things, they're sort of, the chapter almost takes it as read that we need like a transformational effort to kind of ramp up the deployment of technology that we already have. And then we need to start now on those longer term challenges so that when we get to the 2030s and 2040s, we've actually got plausible answers and very well developed policy and programs which will, enable the transition into those other sectors.
Yeah. And I thought it came through very strongly that up till now, a lot of public policy on climate has sheltered industry from its full operational scope, basically for fears of a loss of competitiveness, and that going ahead, well, we need to deal with competitiveness, but it can't be by just setting industry aside. If we're not further along in this transition, we're not going to make it. So just carve-outs are not functional, whereas forms of assistance to transition, as well as more negative incentives to transition, they have their place. You've got to start on the road to get there.
I agree, and carve-outs are not a long-term solution, right? Because all it means is you're outsourcing the problem to the next level of the supply chain, if you like. So I find it interesting that property sector proponents, the owners of buildings, the procurers of concrete, steel, glass, etc., historically have backed carve-outs for emissions-intensive trade-exposed industries. And yet, by doing that, I guess that's sort of adding to the carbon account in their own Scope 3 emissions, right? By saying we're not wanting to deal with that at the source, that's somebody else's Scope 1 emissions. I'll have to account for that and potentially pay for that myself. So I think the transparency piece in all of this is really crucial. And I just agree with your point that sheltering industries is not in their longer term best interest to deal with the problem.
Yeah, if what's being asked is nothing, nothing gets you nothing.
Yeah.
There's one more thing I think maybe in closing on this chapter that could be pulled out, which is that they noted that there was some quite similar themes across industry transformation strategies that they'd found in their review of different economies pathways. And they pointed to 5 elements. So material efficiency and circularity policies, a supply-side push and a demand-side pull through policies for emerging technologies, greenhouse gas pricing for systemic reductions at scale, finance enabling mechanisms to get capital into the sectors needing transformation, and infrastructure provision and institutional support. And like those 5 headings, they're not a bad place to start with thinking. There's a lot of stuff to argue about within all of those categories. But again, thinking about it makes us think about broader integrated policies rather than just one plank at a time.
And thinking about the last decade of policy making in Australia, we've really backed away from I guess on a broader system-wide signals like carbon pricing and the like. But even when we start to unpick challenges specific to each sector and really grapple with the specific measures that are needed, the interconnection between different sectors becomes really apparent. So it's not just, a push on those policy levers that's needed in industry, it's how that connects with other sectors like the building and construction sector, like the transport sector. There are all these areas of overlap. And I think we've not been well served over the last decade here by having such a concentrated focus on just the energy sector and its transition at the expense of every other sector in the economy that, guess what, also needs to get to net zero by 2050.
But the thing that strikes me about that, Frankie, is that the energy sector's the easy bit.
Spoiler alert.
There's a homogenous technology set for the electricity sector that, as technology matures and as prices have come down, and yes, there's issues around flexibility and storage and, maintaining demand over days and over seasons and matching it with supply. But it's actually, there's a lot of the building blocks there, and whereas in some of these other sectors that are, as you say, received less attention, there's a little bit of just hand-waving about, exactly how we're going to do this. And so starting that learning cycle as quickly as possible is going to be absolutely crucial.
Yes.
It's time for one more thing, where we close out the show by sharing something that is currently captivating our attention. Tennant, what have you got?
I was already eagerly awaiting the release of the Victorian gas substitution roadmap, but I'm even more eagerly awaiting it given that this document about how the state sees its pathway to reduce gas use consistent with the net zero by 2050 goal, it's never been more relevant. Everything in it is going to be thought of differently when it comes out, maybe sometime in the next month. We'll see. Maybe it's being rewritten as we speak. But in light of the energy crisis and the very prominent role of gas within that crisis, ways to use less gas and get the services that industry and households need anyway is a pretty big topic. So the government's thoughts on that and what influence they may have on other states and the feds are going to be pretty interesting.
It certainly seems almost inevitable that the sort of actions that have been mooted in public forums and the like around supporting that journey for energy efficiency and electrification would be accelerated in this context, right?
That's right. There was a significant theme in some of the responses to the draft modelling that was released a few months back that were in the genre of, well, yes, these directions are sensible, but we don't want to move too quickly. We want to take no regrets actions so that we're ready when it's clearer whether hydrogen or biogas or electrification are the right answers. So let's get ready for that this decade and then go hard next decade. And whichever of those technologies you like, that answer doesn't seem very credible if we're going to be mortgaging our grandparents to pay the energy bills for the rest of this decade.
It's funny you were sort of mentioning, how this, because the work's been done over the last year or so, how it will be read in a totally different light given current price pressures and there's a ways to go yet. I was reflecting on how differently I was thinking about the UK's heating and building strategy, another paper on our long list of papers to talk about, and it set some timeframes, which I think will now be viewed as too far into the future on deciding what the role for potentially hydrogen, but also the future of gas would look like in buildings over in the UK. We know that's a more acute issue over there. So there's lots of those things kicking around that I think will look even more out of date than they usually do 1 or 2 years after being put out.
All right, Frankie, what would you like to put on our agenda?
I'm staying on the continent over in Europe, and we had the benefit, you and I especially, but also Tennant as well, of meeting Adrian Joyce, who's the campaign director for Renovate Europe, and that's what has been a very successful advocacy campaign running for a decade. I think what we've referred to it as the overnight success that started a decade ago, which advocates for a reduction in energy consumed by the EU building stock by 80% by 2050. And so it was really amazing to hear from Adrian about the journey they've gone on in advocating deep retrofits across the building stock through Europe, and that campaign has really come into its own the last couple of years, particularly through COVID, because a lot of governments in the EU especially looked at putting or committing money to retrofits as a key part of their stimulus packages in terms of the economic recovery. And as we're sort of discussing now, will also have a lot of relevance given what's going on in Europe as well.
Well, I might pick that up because I was going to talk about something that's very much on the same track, which is the Repower EU package that was released from the European Union just a couple of weeks ago, which it's all about the response to, I guess, the energy security challenges posed by the war in Ukraine, and it has sort of 3 planks, right? So it's diversifying the sources of their energy supplies, so trying to, find new sources of oil and gas other than sourcing it from Russia, but interestingly also saving energy both through near-term behavioural measures as well as longer-term sort of deep energy efficiency upgrades in both industry and in buildings, and also, unsurprisingly, accelerating the transition to renewables. And I raise it for a couple of reasons. Obviously, we've been talking today about industrial decarbonisation, and there's a really strong focus on industrial decarbonisation in Repower EU, particularly energy efficiency, electrification and renewables, and they reckon they can save an additional 35 billion cubic metres of gas by 2030, and that's over and above what they were planning on saving with their previous Fit for 55 agenda. But I also think it goes to what you're saying, Frankie, where we've seen this pattern of policy making from the EU over successive crises. Now you had the COVID crisis, and then now we've got this latest crisis driven by Russian aggression, and it isn't derailing their policy making around climate and energy and some of the targets that they've set for themselves. They're actually using it as an opportunity to respond to those crises, but also accelerate their effort towards some of those ambitious climate targets, which I think it's sort of really interesting, the degree to which the Europeans have, so far at least, succeeded in keeping the immediate response and practical responses to these crises in mind, as well as looking forward to sort of some of those longer strategic goals that they're working towards, and trying to make sure that those two things are aligned, which is quite some task when you've got the degree of pressure that they've had on them over the last couple of years.
One of the really interesting things at looking at what's happening in Europe is perhaps just that they're a little bit ahead of us on that journey in terms of how those pressures around pricing are coming home to roost here. So we are absolutely starting to feel it, but consumers in Europe have been suffering 40-50% increases in energy bills for months and months now, and so they're a little more advanced in terms of the response and the thinking in terms of policy measures. And one of the things I found really interesting, a little bit like the conversation around the gas substitution roadmap here in Australia, is that all this policy work had been done, but they've really brought forward timeframes around some of those decision points on, I guess, key pathways. So when it comes to, I talk a lot about buildings because, hey, I do that in my day-to-day. I think it's at an EU level, the directive around not allowing new gas connections in buildings has been brought forward from 2035 to 2025. So they've brought that forward a whole decade. So I do wonder whether that will have implications for us here in Australia as policymakers start to think about what some of those medium and longer term solutions look like.
Well, there's one other thing that they're doing that absolutely will have implications for Australia, because all the acceleration of transition is a huge deal, and the further out in the decade you look, the bigger it is as displacing their reliance on Russian gas specifically and gas in general. But in the near term, they're going to be buying a literal boatload of LNG, and that European demand, along with the inability of Russia to get its existing gas supplies to Europe to other customers anytime soon, is going to keep global gas markets tight and Australian gas prices high for a long time to come.
Which is the diversifying bit. When we say, that sounds like a nice word, diversifying, and creating that extra demand means that, these high gas prices, we will see where they stabilise, Tenant, but they're not going away anytime soon.
That's right. What a happy note to finish on.
On that cheery note, what a time to launch an energy and climate podcast, eh? That is our show for today. If you have comments, questions, or something you want us to cover on a future episode, you can hit us up on Twitter. Frankie is at Frankie Muscovich, Tennant is at Tennant Reid, and my handle is at Luke Menzel. Maybe you can send us something happy or cheery to talk about for next episode. We'll see what you'll come up with. Make sure you never miss an episode by subscribing to Let Me Sum Up in your podcast app of choice. And you'll find this and all future episodes at letmesumup.net. But for now, for Frankie Muscovich and Tennant Reid, I'm Luke Menzel. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you again soon.
We really need to start thinking about more uppers to end these conversations on.
That's right.
There's not a lot. Like we need to keep this sort of short list of one or two things that we could keep revisiting that might be that silver lining in all our conversations.
Well, even with the European thing, if we'd started with they're going to buy a boatload of LNG, but then gone on to, hey, they're going to accelerate the energy transition and it's all going to be great. Yeah, that would have been better. But instead, I had to be raining on everyone's parade. I mean, really, it's Putin's fault. It's not my fault. Well, Vladimir Putin made this a dark podcast.
A little bit of Putin, a little bit of Reid. Who's to say?
Who's to say where the boundaries end?